So we've got our characters being rendered out nicely. However, if you go ahead and press refresh, you're going to see absolutely nothing. So if we refresh, our init function is essentially going to get called. Similarly, if we remove the URL, that is what gives us that initial state setting and also the initial render. So if we go ahead and press refresh, we obviously lose our rendering. So at this point, what we want to do is check if something is in the URL. So if we are on the base route, we want to simply just exit out of our initialization function, which means that underneath we can cater for grabbing all of the IDs that exist. So in similar fashion, where we're asking for the ID and calculating the player and pushing our item into the history and then rendering, we want to essentially do the exact same thing. Now, the only difference is the way that we obtain the ID. So instead of clicking, it's going to actually come from reading the URL. So let's say const ID equals, we can then talk to the window.location.pathname. Just to confirm what's happening here, if we paste this into our DevTools, you can see that we are then given that unique ID. Now, like here, where we have .substring, we're also going to do the same thing, because if we then go and paste this into the DevTools, we then see our ID without that initial /. So at this point, we want to then grab that particular player, push new state into the history, and then render. So essentially the code's exactly the same. And it might be that you want to, in fact, break this out into particular functions, but I'm going to keep these nice and separate for us. So if I save this out and we see a refresh happen, we can then click refresh, and regardless of which page or what looks like a page we are transitioning to, we can refresh every single time. And because we're not on that base route, we're then having some secondary code running, which takes that particular ID, goes and grabs the player that it corresponds to, pushes it into the history, and then renders it out. Now, it might be that you do not want to add a history push state. So in this case, if we were to remove this and start refreshing, it's not going to add an entry into our history, whereas if we add that back in, it will then create a new entry every time we page refresh. So it's up to you which approach you want to go for. I just thought I would show you them both. It's up to you what you want to decide. I'm going to leave mine empty. However, you could, of course, opt for a replace state. If perhaps player had changed in the meantime, then you could go and fetch a new version of the player from the back end. So that's a nice short way that we can read data from the URL. The history object doesn't give this URL to us by default. We have to look at the Windows location, grab the path name, and then trim our string to remove that first character. We can then, as we have already, go and find that particular player and then render it out.